pleasure for me to introduce our last panel of the academic year 2022-2023. And it is, as usual, it is a star-studded panel whom I cannot wait to introduce, although they need no introduction. If you bear with me. Okay, since this is the last panel and before we get to the speakers, I would like to take 2 minutes to just say the following. First of all, I would like to tell everybody that we have had a very, very successful year, and it could not have been done. None of this could have been done, well, without me, but besides that, with Meryl Sofner and Malekar. Whatever you see in terms of, you know, our logistics and all the help that Meryl and Malek have given us throughout the year have been just wonderful. And I wanted to thank you very much, both of you, Meryl and Malek, for all your efforts in the circle. I would also like to thank our previous speakers, Professor Richard Bullitt, Professor Gord Fowden, Professor Fred Donner, Professor David Powers, and Professor Karen Pinto. Thank you all for honoring us and providing us with such fantastic panels. So now, before further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce the colleagues who have likewise honored us with their participation in today's panel on orality in Zoroastrianism, thereby creating our last star-studded panel of today. I am delighted to introduce colleagues who need no introduction, actually. Delighted to introduce colleagues who need no introduction. Professor Martin Schwartz, Professor Almut Hintze, and Professor Peter Jackson Rova. Thank you all very much for Almut, Peter, and Martin for honoring us with your participation today. All of your fans are coming on the screen, are joining us. So today's panel, we will start with, I mean, I cannot tell you how delighted I am that we have this panel. I have said that already, yes, but I'm saying it again. So anyway, we will start with Professor Almut Hintze, who is going to be presenting on tradition and performance in Zoroastrian ritual. I'm going to introduce, although they don't need introduction, each panelist before their talk. Professor Hintze is the Zarathustra Brothers Professor of Zoroastrianism at SOAS, University of London, and a Fellow of the British Academy. She specializes in Zoroastrianism and the tradition of its sacred texts, of which she has published several editions. She directed a collaborative project on multimedia Yasna funded by European Research Council with an advanced investigator grant in 2016 that is continuing currently to 2023 to produce an interactive film of a complete performance of the Yasna ritual, electronic tools for editing Avestan texts, and a text critical edition, translation, commentary, and dictionary of the Avestan Yasna. She has just been awarded her second advanced investigator grant that will take her to 2028. Congratulations, Professor Hintze, for this really splendid achievements. By the European Research Council, again, to investigate the ritual tradition of the Avesta in India. The project team will film the performance of a full Visparat ceremony, provide a critical edition of the Sanskrit translation of the Yasna, and studied the interpretation of Avestan rituals in Gujarati language sources. It is obvious that we are here dealing with one of our brilliant minds. Thank you so much, Almut, for joining us. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for your kind invitation and introduction. And I would like to say how delighted I am to be here with you today, and also to see so many dear friends and colleagues in the audience. So my topic is the oral and written tradition of the Zoroastrian sacred texts. And in particular, I would like to give you an idea of the role which the oral tradition plays in Zoroastrianism alongside the written tradition. And we shall look at this in a historical perspective and against the Indo-Iranian background of the Avesta. I shall talk for about 20 minutes, like each of us, and then later on I understand that we are going to have a panel discussion, Parvaneh, isn't it?
Yes, sure. So, and open the floor to questions from the audience. Yes.
Yes. Sure. Yes. So in this talk, I would like to show the oral context in in both the composition and the tradition of the Zoroastrian sacred text alongside the written tradition. The well-known and peculiar feature, next slide please, of the Zoroastrian tradition is that up to the present day, Zoroastrians pray and perform rituals in the ancient Avestan language, a language which has long ceased to be spoken. Zoroastrians are expected to recite these texts by heart, and even today, a substantial part of the priestly training is dedicated to memorizing them. In addition, a written tradition for the Avestan text started, presumably around 600 of the Christian era, but the oral tradition persists alongside up to the present day. Next slide. The practice of speaking out the ancient texts and knowing them by heart has roots that reach back into the prehistoric Indo-Iranian period, where the later Iranian and Indo-Aryans lived together as one people, presumably in the area of the steppes east of the Ural Mountains. And here on this slide, you can see some of the sites which play a role in this in the academic debate about the migrations of the Indo-Iranians. And in the next slide, you see what archaeologists have found out so far about the early civilizations in the first half of the second millennium BC, and where we might be able to trace the first Iranian-speaking peoples in the north of the Iranian plateau, possibly in the Yazd cultures. Next slide. Although a long time has passed since then and many changes have happened, Avestan and Vedic rituals still share features which point to their common ancestry. Indo-Iranian ritual is an event which has the production of spoken or chanted sound at its center. The type of sound that is being produced is absolutely crucial for the efficacy of the ritual, to the extent that intelligible meaning is of secondary, if of any importance, to those who make the sound. This attitude has led to the text being transmitted over millennia in a frozen linguistic form, which aspiring priests memorized from childhood. And before then, these texts had been composed in performance within a ritual setting while the texts were being used. That means our religious text while a ritual was being performed. So that's how we have to imagine the composition. And then these texts fossilized and started to be transmitted verbatim. And this process must have happened first with the Gathas, because these texts preserve the oldest linguistic form of any Iranian text. The preservation of the spoken word alongside the know-how of ritual actions has always been, and is up to the present day, at the center of priestly training in both Iran and India. And now I would just like to play a clip which shows the training of Vedic priests. And this footage was made by Fritz Stahl of the Nambudiri priest in Kerala in 1975. Could you just play this, please? Hello? Hello?
You weren't able. Okay, let me try to play again because I was muted. Let me know if it's working.
It was, I didn't hear it.
Is it working now? Because I was muted, so the sound was not.
Yes, please.
Which means literally the book. The babies were handed down with writing, word for word, from father to son, from teacher to pupil.
Okay, have you finished?
Okay.
The sound doesn't come through very well, but perhaps, Malak, you need to unmute yourself because otherwise.
I have my volume up and I'm unmuted. Can you hear it better now?
Yeah, but it's okay. I think that has given us a quick idea. Otherwise, it takes too long.
Right.
So this video clip shows the great precision with which sound and intonation of the Vedic text was handed down over the millennia, and to such an extent that Michael Witzel was led to compare Vedic recitation to a sound recording from over 3,000 years ago. Now, in the next slide, you can see a picture from a Zoroastrian learning environment. Here, the boys learn the text by heart, but I have to add that this is taken, this photograph is taken in India because the Zoroastrian priests in Iran have lost the tradition of memorization and performance of Zoroastrian solemn rituals. We can only find them in Iran, in India, and so the training as well only survives amongst the Parsis in India. And there, some of the boys are taught at home by their father or uncle, and others go to priestly boarding schools. The only remaining functioning school today is the Dada Atornan Institute in Mumbai, under its principal Erva Dr. Ramia Karanjia. The boys have several memorization or bhanta classes a day, during which they learn the text while reading it aloud from a book. And then afterwards, they have to come forward and recite what they have learned aloud without the book to their teacher. And now I've got another clip, and please turn on your volume as much as you can and just play that clip, please. It may be on the next slide, actually. I think it's on the next slide. If you just play that clip.
Not this one.
It's next slide, which shows a classroom.
Yeah, okay, you can see it. I see
Yes,
it.
if you please play this, yeah.
Yeah.
No, the sound doesn't really work very well.
I don't know. My volume is up, and
Maybe I share my screen then, and we just use a more imperfect setting
let me
of the Zoom. Shall we?
Is it better now?
The right of the video as well. You might try that one. Where the speaker is and the sound.
I'm gonna stop sharing then.
Yes, and maybe I just share my screen, and you will have a less perfect presentation, but never mind, because somehow my my screen doesn't show what I want you to see. So can you hear this? Can you hear this?
I cannot.
Can you hear
No,
this?
unfortunately, no, unfortunately, Professor.
The sound doesn't come through. Okay. Oh, well, never mind. You haven't missed much because all you hear is what Ramya Karangia calls a cacophony. So they all recite very loudly, all at the same time. And this is how it goes in India. And this is, of course, how the priestly training is done today and in India. And it was in all probability different in the remote past and probably also in Iran. However, what should be clear is that it's very, very different from what you have seen of the training of priests, Vedic priests in 1975. So that the oral tradition of the Avesta has always been less accurate in comparison to the Vedic one is suggested not only by the more relaxed training techniques observable today, but also by the fact that there is little, if any, evidence in the Zoroastrian texts for scientific disciplines such as grammar, phonetics, etymology, comparable to the sciences which the Vedic tradition developed to support the correct transmission of the sound of the Vedic texts. Moreover, the Avestan text, as it appears in the manuscripts, shows numerous variants and dialectal features which must have entered the pronunciation of the Avesta at different times. And we find dialectal features which go back to the Achaemenid period, and dialectal influences on the recitation text continue right up to the present day. So there are, can you see the next slide now with the performances of solemn rituals? Can you see that?
No, we cannot.
No.
No.
So you
should
don't,
I go back to sharing it from my screen if you want.
I think you have to, yeah, sorry.
No
I don't
worries.
know why
Let's-
this is not
no worries.
working. So I
Stop
share.
sharing so I can share my screen.
Yeah, yes, please.
No worries. Let me go back to it. Okay. Is it visible now?
Yes, and if you
Yes,
please go one
yes.
slide further down, one more.
All right.
Yes, this one. Thank you. Thank you. That's fine. There are two quite different areas in which the Zoroastrian tradition exceeds the Vedic one. One of them is the frequency with which high rituals are performed, although they are an endangered heritage in both traditions. Vedic solemn or Shrouter rituals are occasionally conducted even today in both North and especially South India, and some important work has been done on recording performances, notably by Fritz Stahl. But in terms of frequency of performances, the Zoroastrian rituals here outperform their Vedic sister. There are still several yasna performances per month happening today, a Vesperet a couple of times a year, and the 12-day Niragdin ceremony, which includes the recitation of a full Videvdat ritual, is also regularly carried out several times a year. A major reason for this relatively higher frequency of performances of Zoroastrian high rituals is probably that they are less demanding in terms of the number of ritual personnel and regarding the time required. For while the performances of a Shrouter ritual is very costly, as it requires a minimum of 17 priests and lasts for several weeks, if not months, the shorter one of the Zoroastrian solemn ceremonies, the yasna, only requires 2 priests and takes about 2.5 hours. The other solemn rituals used to require 8 priests, but that number has now been reduced to 2. Next slide. The other area in which the Zoroastrian tradition outperforms the Vedic one is the textual transmission. Here we have these Vedic texts. They only describe the roles of individual priests, but they do not describe an actual ritual as it is to be performed. By contrast, our Western liturgical manuscripts do exactly this, and to such an extent that it is possible to compare what we find in a manuscript with what we can see in an actual performance. And this is what we did in the Multimedia Yasna project. While the Avestan Sade or liturgical manuscripts provide full descriptions of the performance of different rituals, with the words to be recited and the actions to be performed spelled out, the Rig Veda is a sort of database, a collection of 1,028 hymns to be used in different kinds of rituals. The Rig Veda, Sama Veda, and the Yajur Veda provide the repositories for their respective priests. Each of these three Vedas has its own group of priests who do their specialized actions during the performance of a ritual. And even the Shrauta Sutras, which describe not complete rituals, but each of them is a manual for one of these priestly classes and provides the instructions for that particular class only. It's only in the performance of an actual Vedic ritual that all these different roles can be seen together in action. And I've got here my last clip, and shall we just try again? It's the next slide, and just have a go to see. At least you can see how they move, even if you can't hear the sound. And we don't have to play it all.
All rites are performed on behalf of the sacrificer or Yajaman.
So perhaps that's enough then. So here you can see the various different classes of priests. One is the sitting one, here the chief priest, the hotar, and who sits there and performs. And this is actually, no, this one, the one who is standing, he's the hotar, and this one here, he is the one who pours the offering into the ritual fire. Thanks to the recordings of performances of Vedic and Zoroastrian rituals, we can still see a number of Indo-Iranian concepts embodied and enacted in these ritual performances. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah, thank you. Up to the present day, rituals in both branches are conducted by ritual experts, the priests, for a fee to be paid by the person who has hired them to perform the ritual. Thus, three parties are involved in an Indo-Iranian ritual: the host, who orders the ritual, secondly, the personnel, that's the priests who conduct it, and finally, the guests, which are the gods. It has long been recognized that the Indo-Iranian ritual is perceived as an act of hospitality, which human beings offer to the gods. The ritual is a banquet at which the gods are fed and entertained. The gods are offered a comfortable seat on fragrant grass. They are entertained with praise and song, during which the texts, some of which we have, are composed in performance, and they are given food and drink in the form of oblations. Each offering in the fire is made to a particular god or a set of gods, and they are urged to partake it. The model of an Indo-Iranian ritual is that of a formal meal, a ceremonial hospitality. Being invited guests, the gods come to the ritual precinct, bring with them numerous gifts of hospitality, take a comfortable seat on the ritual precinct, enjoy the offerings, and at the end they depart to return to their heavenly abodes, strengthened, invigorated, and satisfied. And the gifts which the god bestow on the host who has commissioned the ritual renew and ensure the host's and his own and his family's life force and prosperity. Anyone who has entertained guests knows that hosting a banquet requires preparation. The stage is prepared for the ritual, And that takes up a substantial part in both Vedic and Zoroastrian ceremonies. And in Vedic ritual, the ritual space is made from scratch. And here in the next slide, you can see how this is the design of the ritual with the 3 fires in the Vedic ritual, and the Vedi, which is the sacrificial space where the ritual offerings are placed. And next one. Next, and here you can see the ritual, the Vedi, which is that space where the offerings are placed. It's being dug into the soil. Next one. And here again, as it is completed. So it's all made from scratch in the Vedic ritual. Next one. And here you can see the priest in action sitting in front of the Vedi, and here is all the barasum which is being spread out to provide a seat for the gods. Next one. And next one. In the Zoroastrian ritual precinct of the Zoroastrian high ritual liturgy, has the equivalent of the Vedi is a sacrificial table on which the ritual implements are carefully arranged. The priest sits on a seat facing south. The axis of orientation in the Zoroastrian ritual is north to south, with the priest turning his back to the northern direction where evil comes from. Next one. Here as well. And then the next one. This is a ritual table on which the implements are displayed. They include cups, saucers, knife, mortar, and pestle. And they are used, these implements are used for ritually preparing the sacrificial meal, consisting of solid and liquid food, which is consumed by the priest at precisely defined points in the ritual. In the yasna ceremony, the preparation or paragna ceremony takes up about 1/4 of the time of the entire ritual. In the contemporary practice in India, the only place in the world where Zoroastrians still perform these rituals, the preparation ceremony involves the procuring of water, of the milk, of plants, and the preparation of the hauma drink. And this is the setting of a Zoroastrian high ritual as we can still witness it. In my multimedia Yasna or Muya project, we filmed the performance of a Yasna ceremony in Mumbai, and this is now available online. And I would just like to show you one couple of more clips, if you can move on to the, maybe to the next one. Next one. So try this one here.
Okay.
To play. Thank you. Okay, that's enough. Thank you. Just leave it here. So here you can see this is one of the sites, a passage from our film which we made, and you can see the video itself, and you can see in subtitles the words, the Avestan words which the priests recite. You can read them, and there is a translation, and the ritual actions are those which we find in the manuscripts. And then there is also an encyclopedia which explains the ritual implements and parts which are used within the ritual performance. So in general, rituals take place in ordinary life as well as in a specific ritual context, and they display different degrees of formalism, traditionalism, invariance, rule governance, and symbolism. And the more formalized the ritual, the less variance one would expect. We think that the Vedic Soma ritual and the Avestan Hauma ritual have common Indo-Iranian roots, but the way they are performed today in the two traditions shows great discrepancies, which point to changes within the two traditions, so that to ritual change over long periods of time. But it is within this kind of setting that we have to imagine the composition of the Avestan text to have happened and the fossilized text to have been handed down for many, many generations. It is impossible to understand the Avestan text without understanding the rituals, settings, and that within the oral tradition. Thank you. I finished now.
Thank you so much, Almut, for this fascinating talk and this multimedia Yasna that you've been forming is just incredible. Is this public or not?
Yes, the website, I'll put the website into the chat and you can look it up there.
Yes, fantastic.
The
Okay.
translation hasn't yet been made public, but it should become available soon.
Well, I'm sure many people here would love to access it and
Yeah.
work with it. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Thank you very much, Almut. So we're going to go to our next speaker, Professor Martin Schwartz, who's going to be talking about the Gathas and orality. Mystagogy. Please tell me, Martin, if I pronounce that right or not, and memory.
Sorry, orality and textuality. Oh, I'm
Yes.
sorry, Mr. Goji.
Mr. Goji. Okay, okay, great.
He's
Thank
not
you.
a person. He's not Mr. Goji, which
No,
is-
it's okay. Yes.
Mr. Goji. In fact,
Okay.
leading people into mysteries is what the word means. Mr. Goji.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank
We
you.
like these alliterative titles, many of us. In fact, there'll be more Mr. Goji than memory in my presentation. But
Excellent, excellent. Just a few minutes. You don't need any introduction, Martin. Everybody is well aware of your stature in the field.
Parvaneh, can you hear me?
Yes, of course.
Good, good.
Yes, of course. So just a short introduction. Professor Martin Schwartz is Professor Emeritus of Iranian Studies in the Department of Middle Eastern Languages and Cultures at the University of California at Berkeley. His chief teaching and research activity is in pre-Islamic Iranian, Central Asiatic languages, literatures, and religions. To this, he brings a knowledge of Indo-European, including Vedic, and Indo-European historical, linguistic, and spiritual world of the Gathas of Zoroaster. And Indo-European historical linguistics and languages of the Near East. His focal interest in the poetic, intellectual, and spiritual world of the Gathas of Zoroaster, whose esoteric dimension and complex compositional structures he has discovered, has brought a new methodology to the study of the Gathas of the Avesta. And I must say, this is his Professor Schwartz's work in this regard is just brilliant. His lectures include invited presentations at Collège de France, University of Bonn, Aarau University in Yerevan, at the University of La Sapienza in Rome, University of Salamanca in Spain, at Turfan Forschung Akademie der Wissenschaft in Berlin, and at finally the Institute for Iranistic in Vienna. Professor Schwartz gained his PhD under W.B. Henning at the University of Berkeley. Professor Schwartz, Martin, without any further ado, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you so much, Parvaneh.
You're welcome.
First, orality. For my Gatha-focused talk, I'll speak of two different phenomena under the name of orality. One, what interesting things may be done by a pre-literate author in a genre of poetry? And two, what possible long-time survival without written mediation of orally originated data, which I'll offer one speculative example in passing, but I hope it'll be an interesting example. As to Zoroaster, that is the historical, non-Nietzschean, real Zarathustra, the poet-priest, single author of the Gathas. Well, yes, there was such a person, in my opinion, and this is against Kellen's and Scherver's opinion. I affirm his existence, in part because the poems reflect the author's concern for getting patrons, some of whom are named, in a context of rivalry between poet-priests and their patrons, and thereby between religious ideas. I won't go into this, but Zarathustra was a religious innovator. So he was in a context of competition with other religious views, some very much like the Rigvedic worldview. Okay. And the historical reality of Zarathustra as composer of the Gathas is also shown by their intertextuality and unifyingly remarkable compositional structures and style. Briefly, and much of this is my own view, Zarathustra flourished between 1400 and 1000 BCE, somewhere in Central Asia, and composed a final corpus chiefly consisting of 17 poems, each called a hati, or concatenated composition, in reference to their ring compositional symmetrical structures, which I've clarified, and their 5 metrical types, whereby they were eventually grouped, reordered as to compositional chronology, grouped into 5 Gathas. So Gathas are really 5 metrical groups of 17 poems. Long after Zarathustra, they were put in the middle of a long heterogeneous series of liturgical texts, the yasnas, on which Almut touched, and the Gothic poems were assigned yasna numbers, which have nothing to do with their chronology. So yasna 46 doesn't mean it's the 46th poem composed by Zarathustra, and its relationship to, let's say, yasna 32. In reality, for compositional reasons, I assign 46 priority to 32. So don't pay much attention to these numbers. They're just identificatory tags, as it were. In any event, the Gothic corpus is the oldest stratum of that long literate heterogeneous corpus called the Avesta, much of which reflects religious ideas very different from the Gathas. And for the old Iranian period already, I emphasize that not everything which is Zoroastrian is from Zoroaster, that unique religious and poetic genius that is Zarathustra. And the entirety of the Avesta was transmitted orally for many, many centuries by priestly mnemonists. Their mnemonic techniques can't be said at present, but they could, way back when, have been very much like the systematic memorization that we find still alive in the Indic tradition. But that's
Forgive
unclear.
me, Martin,
Yeah.
forgive me for interrupting. Whenever you want your handout to be distributed,
I will.
please
Thank
let
you.
us know.
Thank
Okay.
you. Thank you.
Sorry, yes.
Thank you.
Sure.
We'll do that, Parvaneh. Thank you. We'll do that at our end. Okay? Olga will be hitting the necessary keys. Okay, so finally they were written down centuries, many centuries after, sometime around, I don't know, the end of the Sasanian period, early Islamic period. They were written down in a special script. The details of how the poems are handed down and the manuscript transmission are not what I'm going to talk about, interesting as they may be. So that's my my preface, and now please, wishes. Yeah. Okay.
Oh.
Okay, so you have here a very difficult well, it's not so difficult, it's not the most difficult stanza of Yasna 32, and I'm translating it. He indeed misdirects words, who declares that the worst person is to see cow and sun with his eyes of evil. That's one word. It's in the dualized vocabulary. This is the eyes which are evil, and who makes the wrongsome persons out as lawful ones and throws the pastures apart and lifts a weapon toward, which is to say, against the righteous person. One can translate this in another way. He indeed ruins my reputation, says Zarathustra. That's another possibility. The phrase, he who makes the wrongsome ones out as rightful ones, the reverse of that is also possible. He who makes the lawful ones to be wrongsome ones, it's also possible. So there is a certain amount of ambiguity here already, and that's a characteristic of much of this poetry, intentional, pointed ambiguity. Pointed meaning there's a reason for it, and people are supposed to think and figure it out. And most importantly, the beginning phrase, how ma, and that should be a long there, how ma nasrawa, you can take it to mean upon, via hauma, hauma, and not hauma. And in fact, the poem, second half at least, is about Hauma. And we can see that because the word Durausha occurs in the 14th stanza. That is known as an epithet of Hauma in the hymn to Hauma. Now, these words that I have put in bold and the underscored section, all of those words occur in a different order, different arrangement, as invocations against the enemy in an old hymn, in an old form of what we now know as the hymn to Halma, Yasna 9, Yasna 10, and well, I don't know about Yasna 11. We have a poem as part of the Young Avesta called the Homyasht, sections of which can be reconstructed as octosyllabic verses, and Zarathustra had to know an early version of this poem, some of which in fact corresponding to the present text of the Homyasht, and he turns it on his head here. He takes on its head, he takes its words and does a kind of jazz recomposition, twisting it against itself, against the hymn to Halma, and thus against the priests and patrons of the Halma cult. So that's a discovery of mine I made a number of years ago. Now, let's go down to the figure called traditionally Yima, but actually it was pronounced Yama in the earliest period. In the Homyasht, the Yashtu Halma, he is, Yima is the prize that his father, Wiwahwant, meaning the radiant one, got for being the first person to press Halma. Now, in fact, in the Gothic text, Yima is condemned. Of those violators, Yima Wiwanghusha indeed became ill-famed by going astray by swearing to be someone who wished to gratify us mortals by means of a god, by offering them a god, by offering himself, in fact, as a god. If, says Zarathustra, I am among such violators, O Mazda, that is in thy determination. There are 2 points. The phrase, the epithet, in fact, Wiwanghusha, which characterizes Yama, differs from the traditional epithet, Wiwanghwant. It looks like a past perfect participle, meaning the one who once was radiant, but who faded, formerly radiant, and no longer radiant. And so Yima himself, through the change of his patronymic, is not represented by his traditional name. And that is the technique that Zarathustra does. As he did in the case of Halma, he presents it as a kind of wordplay, and indeed as is done with the name of the evil spirit, Angramanyu, which does not occur in that formulation throughout the Gathas, but it is hinted at in various ways. Now, this Wiwanghusha, I can say briefly, can also be interpreted as he who earns that which is not good, breaking it up as Wiwanghusha, Wiwanghu, not good, sha, earning, gaining, compare Wijua in Avestan, Wijua, not living, and in Vedic, Pashu, sha, gaining cattle. So a lot of wordplay there, again pointed and again subtle. Now, I think that Zarathustra hopes to avoid the imputation of himself showing hubris. And in fact, there is a continuum between the stanzas, Yasna 46:18, where Zarathustra is confident about having gratified Zarathustra and Ahura Mazda, and Zarathustra says, and that is the decision of my mind and my discernment. A little hubristic, perhaps, textually related to this stanza, in which we have the idea of gratification, and Zarathustra saying, well, I don't know if I'm a sinner like Yima, that Mazda Ahura is in your discernment. And finally, in Yasna 49:1, he says, I merely wished to gratify the poorly protected ones on behalf of Mazda. So these three passages are all compositionally linked according to a schema which runs through the entirety of the Gathas, which I call SCRIM, an acronym for serially, correspondent, recursive, intertextual mechanics. And I've given a description of that with a specific kind of example in the Festschrift for Almut Hintze, called Reward for the Righteous. You can have a look at that article. Unfortunately, the chart here is fuzzy, but in fact, I derive the vocabulary of much of the sequentially, stanza by stanza, of Yasna 30 from Yasna 32 in two directions. This is line after line, in fact, or at least stanza after stanza, corresponding words or word forms and sometimes roots exactly in sequence in one direction and in another direction. Now, if you will notice where I've marked, you have in Yasna 32, our passage 32:8, Yama Chit, Yamas Chit, let's say Yama. And then in Yasna 33, the word Yama, which is a variant spelling, they both amount to Yama. Yama is actually under influence of the younger Western, but they're the same word originally. Yama was mythologically, as he is in Vedic, the twin. And what is very interesting is that from his name, Mr. Twin, as it were, Zarathustra in Yasna 30, where he speaks about the two primordial spirits, which are opposed, he calls them the twinned spirits. That is a very nice way of indicating that they are in some way counterparts of each other. They're twins, so to speak, a good and an evil one. But I think his idea for that came from his process of going from one poem to another. I have produced scores and scores of these charts, by the way, so it's not going to be coincidental. And one can make a flow chart of the order of at least many, many of the compositions thereby. So when I said that there's evidence through three passages for Zarathustra, here trying to say, well, I hope I'm not like Yama, I hope I'm not hubristic. Those passages are all formally linked according to this scheme that I've illustrated here. Okay, next, please. How am I doing time-wise, Parvaneh? How much time do I have? Can you tell me? I can't hear you.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Frankly, I was just listening to you.
Okay, I'll try to go through quickly, okay?
Yeah.
All right.
We started late anyway.
It's interesting that how different these translations can be. Can we go back to the first page of my handout? Okay, so you see, of those violators, Yema indeed became ill-famed, going astray by swearing to be someone who wished to gratify us mortals by means of a god. My translation, and in a way, some of this interpretation goes back to Humbach, an old article is. And I'm not going to go through, it'll take a little while, the exact details of this translation. Some of it you can see from the article by Charve in the Encyclopedia Iranica under Jamshid. But now let's get back to the Humbach's translation. Even Yema, the son of Wiwakwant, is notorious for such outrages. Even he who tries to satisfy us humans and our animals with the injunction, meat is just part of a complete meal. For that one of these outrages being subject to that well-known decision of yours, O wise one. Meat eating, you may as well be talking about a completely different text here. And Humbach bases it on two Middle Persian texts, one translation of the Gathas and the other in what's been called a Zoroastrian encyclopedia, the Middle Persian Denkard, which differ in interpretation, but agree that the passage concerns a command to, quote, eat animal meat according to apportionment. And those two Pahlavi texts are the only written commentary in the later tradition about this passage, this meat-eating business, which can be shown to be a misinterpretation of the wording of the text, according to people who no longer understood the text. Now, what is interesting is that Ferdowsi, in the late 10th century, and authors of that period have Yema, Jamshid, Yema Shaita Jamshid, claimed to be creator and to demand being worshipped as a god. So the gist of that very, very subtle, complicated passage as I translated it, somehow survived, perhaps, the many, many centuries without written intermediation. So I think, and that's that speculation as to longevity, possible longevity of orality that I mentioned earlier. Now, I'm going to jump to the Greek poet, the archaic Greek poet, Pindar. The beginning of his second Olympian, the famous passage, which god, which hero, which man shall we proclaim or sing? And then he goes on to say, well, to Zeus there belongs Pisa, Heracles established the Olympiad, and Theron is to be proclaimed for his race victory. Scrambled, what I called as mixophony, a kind of oral anagram, in backwards order, in the question, Tina Theon, Tina Eroa, Tina Dandra, Keladesomen, we have the sounds of the answers in backwards order, namely Theron, Heracles, and Zeus. Accusative. Now, there is both in Pindar and Zarathustra a rivalry between the poets, and in Yasna, in Second Olympian 85 to 88, Pindar states that a hermaneus, which doesn't mean an interpreter, but as Glenn Most showed, someone who can make latent speech manifest, is needed. And what is the latent speech here? Well, we'll see. Pindar continues, there are swift missiles in my quiver, swift arrows in my quiver. And these have sounds for those who can understand. Phonanta, synatoisen, phonanta, synatoisen. And he says the wise one is he who is knowing naturally. He contrasts that with those who are prolix. They just run on and are disorderly. In all, quote, manner of tongues, like a pair of ravens. Maybe he's talking about two poets, maybe Simonides and Bacchylides, I don't know. But ravens tend to go in pairs. They speak things which do not come into effect. So they just chatter. Now, line 90, Pindar will shoot his, quote, arrows of good praise, and he's stretching the bow toward the city of Akragas, which is home of his patron Theron. And the line describing the prolix and disorderly poets, and the line describing Pindar's targeted aim are iconic, the meaning. Both encrypt the same focal sounds, but the second line compactly, that's a whole line there, that akraganti tanusais, because of the structure of the verses, you have long and short lines, compactly achieves the goal, as it were, akragas. So there you have the same sounds. That becomes very clear with akranta garuaton. They chatter things that come to no effect, versus akraganti tanusais. It is to akragas that I'm shooting. And Pindar's phonanta synatoisen ultimately reflects the Orphic formula aido synatoisen. And the poem's eschatology, the Second Olympian, may be of Orphic origin. And the similarity of, let's say, when I say aido synatoisen, I mean, I sing to those who understand, like having speech to those who understand. And we'll see that Zarathustra uses a similar formula. I, address those who understand. And that's where you get the mystagogy, that's where you get the crypticism. The formula eschatology, parallel with Gathas, raise deeper questions. And here I have in mind Peter Jackson Rova's ideas. There may be here questions, a question of a mutually underlying Indo-European mystagogy. That's something one can talk about for a day. Next, please. We need some examples of what I call mixophony and acrophony. Mixophony is this technique we saw in Pindar. Sounds, scrambled sounds of a targeted word, which are quasi-anagrammatically scrambled within the line. So don't look at screen. I'm going to give you 3 examples of that technique. And yeah, stop sharing for a moment. That's just as good. Thanks. Pardon me, I'm just moving out of the sun, which is now oppressively in my face. So just listen to this, and I'm now going to be oral. I'm going oral on you. And you'll have to listen, because this is what they did in the ancient time. We're talking about orality. They heard. Plus, I didn't want to have a huge handout and was running out of time. Never mind. Okay, so this means, I shall tell you, O ye who seek the things to be understood indeed by the knower. The knower. With good minds praise and worshipfulness for the Lord, who is very wise, and for rightness, the things to be seen, okay, with the lights and bliss. Listen to the best things with your ears, and look with a bright mind. It says, listen to the best things. This is a buzzword. It's a very important word throughout the Gathas. Wahishta, it includes the sense of Persian behesht, which means paradise, means literally the best things. And that best things runs throughout the text. And I want you to hear, according to what Zarathustra says, hear Wahishta, hear the best things, okay? So this is the first line. Ata waksha ishanta, Yamasdatha yachit vidushai, Srauta gaushai shwahishta. And so within that opening, Ata waksha ishanta, you have scrambled Wahishta. There are many passages like this.
Martin?
Yes.
Professor Schwartz, I can't believe I'm saying this, but if
Please
you
go
could
ahead, yes.
kindly, if you kindly could conclude, because we still have Peter to talk, and then we want to discuss.
Okay, let's go back to the screen. Now, there are 2 techniques, the sound scramble technique and a mystique of the initial sounds of words that have significance. So a pattern, or sometimes repeated as the beginning of words, represents wahu mana, one of the constant triad with ahura mazda and with arta wahishta, meaning good mind, meaning best rightness. These sounds in various poems get repeated again and again. Now, all of those sounds come into play in what you see on the screen here in the underscored words. And those underscored words I've extracted here. And they illustrate what the second stanza says about Mazda being united with good mind and also with best rightness. This triad is repeated again and again and again in Yasna 28, which is related to this poem. And if you look at the words as I've tabulated them, you see the overlapping sounds Ahya Hurahya, Urzana Mat Aryamna, Razma, Mazda, give you the sequence of initials, Awa, Awa, plus M, if you group it that way, plus M, Wama, plus M, and again, M, Wa, and M, Wa. In other words, you have in two different orders the initial sounds of that divine triad. How one would hear this, how this would be performed, what clues Zarathustra gave to his patrons, perhaps outside of the frame of recitation, we can't say. It is rather a remarkable use of orality, far beyond mere initial sounds of words to give you the individual theological entities' names. And finally, we have an oral acrostic. In a definition of piety, they will be in the desire and achieve the favor of Ahura Mazda. That line, which occurs among many, many resemblances to Yasna 32.1 above, formulaic references to entreaty and to unity and whatnot. In the midst of that, where you would expect the word rasma because of the formulaic setting, you don't get it. What you get is an acrostic, which is the last line here. Warai radanti orahya zaushai mazda. And I can recite it, I will, as my final act here, so that you'll hear rasma. If you notice that there is a ra, ra, ra in the first three words, so you can resonate that as follows and do it in a sequence of steps. Okay, with the sun in my eyes, I'll do it anyway. Sorry. Something like that. So you get with all those resonances and so forth. There may be a few more steps, but we've run out of time, so those few steps will have to suffice. In any event, this is a rather remarkable illustration of the possibilities of orality. I wish I could justify this time-wise in greater detail, but I'll stop and thank you for attention and apologies for running on, and looking forward now to Peter Jackson Rova's presentation.
Thank you so much, Professor Schwartz, for this really enlightening way of understanding the gathas and the possibilities of oral transfer. We are going to go forward, in fact, to Professor Peter Jackson Rova. May I ask everyone to close their sounds, please? Professor Rova is Professor. I'm sorry, somebody's sound is still on.
I muted Parvaneh, I muted them. No.
Okay, thank you, Malak. Okay, so once again, Professor Rova is a professor of history of religions at Stockholm University, Sweden. His research focuses on the study of Indo-European religions with an emphasis on ancient Indian and Iranian religions, the religions of ancient Greece and Rome, and Old Norse religion. By undertaking the comparative task of exploring how recurrences in the earliest cultic and heroic poetry of ancient India, Iran, Greece, and the Germanic world provide clues to the common past of these traditions, he has made an effort to show that there is sufficient cultural data embodied in the hereditary Indo-European poetic vocabulary to invite serious anthropological and historical consideration, thus opening a window to a critical phase in Eurasian prehistory. Jackson Rova is a member of the interdisciplinary research program, LAMP, which is Languages and Myths of Prehistory, and is currently cooperating with Norbert Oettinger, University of Erlangen in Germany, in preparing a general survey of common linguistic traits in Indo-European religious traditions. Preliminary title, Compendium der Indo-Germanischen Religion. His most recent book, Devotion and Artifice, Themes of Suspicion in the History of Religions, is scheduled to appear in the Greuter's series Religion and Reason by the end of July 2023. Thank you so much, Professor Rova, for having accepted our invitation. It is a pleasure to have you, and I am sure from what I know of your research, is going to be really fascinating how you provide, just as Martin did, how you provide and Almut did, you provide a context, a proto-context, I mean, proto-Indo-European context, actually, for the traditions of the Greeks and the Iranians. Thank you so much. We're looking very much forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much, Parvaneh. Thank you to the other speakers, to Almut and Martin. I'm the last speaker, so you have to excuse me if some of the things I'm going to tell you now you have already heard. I'm also the odd one out here because unlike Almut and Martin, I have not spent as much time working on ancient Iranian poetry, but mainly done so from this comparative perspective. So leaving aside the fact that Avestan and Vedic liturgical texts still form part of living traditions, we've already heard this, we need to take into consideration that they have emerged from within an ancient oral culture that was once far more fluid, open-ended, than the institutionalized religions and textual canons that eventually took shape in their wake. So that's what I'm interested in now. And the earliest part of the Avesta, known as the Yasna or liturgy, consists of liturgical hymns or gathas attributed to a figure who presents himself as Zarathustra. And I believe with Martin that this is the poet, the author of the hymns. So there are biographical details about himself. It's a very cohesive, well-structured text, almost idiosyncratic. He reveals biographical details about himself, his family, his patrons. He appears to us as a wandering poet, a ritual specialist, a so-called zautar, libationer, belonging to a pastoral society in which cows and horses and camels are not just livestock, but also measures of wealth. And one gets the strong impression that he seeks to promote his ritual services in competition with other ritual specialists. So where do we find our best comparanda? because we want to put this into context, and it would have been very difficult with just access to these very difficult cryptic texts of the Gathas. Well, perhaps I should share my screen with you here. So we, yeah, well, the Rigvedic hymns are, as you've already understood, linguistically and poetically very close to the Gathas. They share with the Gathas a common ritual idiom, you could say. Perhaps we might better treat Avestan and Vedic as dialects rather than different languages. They reflect a common and not so distant Indo-Iranian tradition. But the situation is quite different in India compared to Iran, because here we have access to a totality of 10 collections or mandalas, cycles, who became canonized as a whole, once again, most likely without the help of writing, perhaps by the mid-first millennium BC. They are attributed to different poets with different patrons who differ in terms of style and devotional preferences. They are addressed to various deities or groups of deities and originally transmitted within different priestly lineages. So if one were to make sense of the Avestan or Gothic situation in terms of the Vedic, one might imagine a corpus of texts emerging from the composition of just one of these poets or priestly lineages. That would have been so what we have in the Gathas. Since the poets, both in Vedic and Avestan, in the earliest Vedic and Avestan poetic texts, are remarkably present and self-conscious in their own compositions, we also understand that many of these hymns were originally composed for a singular ritual occasion. So they were not composed to be part of a repeated, a corpus of hymns to be repeated in exactly the same fashion. They were performed and composed for a specific occasion in which the poets also addressed their patrons within their poems with explicit references to the gifts, usually cows or other domesticated animals, which they receive in return for their performance. So this fairly simple logic of gift exchange between poet and patron becomes immensely important to our understanding of Indo-Iranian ritual. And I think Almut touched upon this with her figure, with her triangle, both in a rather blunt rhetorical sense, because this becomes a means of maintaining cash flow. If you want prestige and a prosperous coexistence between the ritual worker, the poet sacrificer, and the employee, usually representing the ruling warrior class. But the logic of gift exchange also reaches levels of highly elaborate forms of poetic self-reflection. The newness, for instance, of a composition, the newness of a hymn is essential. The pact between the poet and patron, the artistic and cultic excellence of the former, and the generosity, the heroic appearance, athletic achievement of the latter is also projected onto the gods. Gods appear in the role of, or as idealized poets and priests, and gods appear in the role of idealized patrons, providing wealth by conquering others, receiving the prize of athletic achievement, and so on. But there are also, in both poetic traditions, the image of fake priests, bad priests, malicious priests, and bad rulers who seek to deceive. And also we should pay attention to the significance of value and poetic performance, what to do with words, recall Austin's famous lectures, How to Do Things with Words. These poets were well aware of what they could do with words, the merits to receive in return for due compensation. These features of oral poetry and poetics that so characteristically come to expression in the hymns of the Rig Veda and in the Gathas are not just based on a common Indo-Iranian tradition, but can in their turn be traced back to an even earlier Indo-European tradition, which entailed more than a common linguistic heritage, as reflected in the grammar and vocabulary of the Indo-European languages, but also a common set of poetic conventions, formulaic structures, metaphors, etc., seen especially in the ancient poetry of the Greeks, Italic peoples, Celts, and to some extent also in Germanic tradition. There are traces of praise poetry in Indo-Iranian ancient poetry, even though these are hymns mostly addressing gods, but the genre is of heroic praise is best preserved in Greece. And we've already seen examples of that in Martin's presentation. Poetic praise is also linked to a linguistic ideology of obscurantism. Poets and supposedly the patrons show a fondness for cryptic poetic devices. You find examples of various sound effects echoing words and names secretly encoded within the verse. And this doctrine has perhaps sometimes been a bit exaggerated, for instance, in the works of, or in the posthumous works of Ferdinand de Saussure. One must still ask what such tendencies towards secrecy were about. And you've already seen examples of this, of course. Now, the question would be raised how notions of heroic fame and the sacrifice of fee might help us better understand notions about the afterlife. And first, I should mention that that Almut, our first speaker, has in fact devoted a whole monograph to the theme of the sacrifices in Indo-Iranian cultic poetry. So let's make clear from the start that the principle of reward can be thought of both in material and in spiritual terms, and it involves both the poet sacrificer, the poet priest, and the patron who finances the sacrificial service. Fame and glory, the fact of being heard and remembered, is both something to which the poet aspires and something that he presents as the delayed payback or spiritual reward awaiting the generous patron. So how might this principle resonate with notions about the afterlife? Well, there is the idea that the song itself could be thought of as a kind of spiritual dwelling. And I give you the following example from a Vedic hymn to begin with, in which the poet, we know the name of this poet we usually do in the case of Vedic poetry, Kavasha Ailusha, addresses his prospective future patron, Upamashravas, by praising the generosity of his dead former patron, Pourshariati, who was the father of Upamashravas. He says, I choose, of course, a way of putting it from the poet's perspective that he actually made this choice himself. I choose the father of Upamashravas, for whom there were sweet songs, delightful, like a dwelling place, kshetra, for one at home in it. So when Kavasha presents his addressee with the notion of a habitable song, dir plus kshetra, he is also bringing into play the fame, shravas, shravana, encoded in the names both of his former patron and of his present addressee. So I take this situation to be indicative of a recurrent concept in the Gathas, namely the so-called house of laudation, house of song, which I shall now give you a few examples of. More than a fancy metaphor, I believe the recurrent Gothic notion of Garo Dmana, the house of song, house of welcome, has also been suggested. I believe that there is, if you compare the Vedic and the Western examples of this noun, the context is certainly that of inviting or welcoming guests, but in the form of a song. So I think it makes sense to translate this as house of laudation or song. This concept was apparently imagined by the poet and his auditor, not just as a house in which praise is sung, which it could mean, of course, but also as possibly as a dwelling forged by the poet's song, just as you could see exemplified in the Vedic hymn I showed you earlier. And according to Yasna 51:15, Ahura Mazda, the wise lord, enters into the Garo Dmana as the first or primal one by being first subjected to poetic praise, and it's along the same itinerary that the open-handed patron, the adherent or benefactor, will finally receive the prize, Mishta, of joining his supreme lord as guest. This logic of eschatological compensation can be expressed differently by instead presenting the poet's fee, Mishta, as the guarantor of the patron's higher existence, which you see exemplified here. I just give you the translation of Humbach from by Skerve here. He who in accordance with truth make real for me, for Zarathustra, that which is most brilliant in my imagination, for me who deserves a prize providing higher existence. Mishtam Parahum. In other words, the fee-paying patron may enjoy the beneficial results of the ritual, the patron's reward, only in return for due compensation, the poet's reward. Now, finally, I wanted to say a few things about philosophy, because as you of course know, Nietzsche is the one who succeeded in making the name Zarathustra more famous in the West than anyone else, because he made Zarathustra his hero and spokesperson. But in fact, as you might suspect, Nietzsche was not really interested in the message of the historical figure. Rather, he looked upon and even explicitly refers to him as the inventor of an ill, of the struggle between good and evil that he must have been the first to see beyond. So that's his way of explaining why he chose Zarathustra as his spokesperson. But perhaps there is another aspect to this philosophical heritage. I believe that there are things we can say about the beginnings of Greek philosophy by comparing early or ancient Greek philosophical discourse with that of ancient Iranian. And I will give you just a very brief summary of what I think in this regard. First, if we were to look for links between the poet of the Gathas, between this ancient poetic tradition and the ancient Greek philosophers, the way to go is precisely to acknowledge the fact that they were all drawing from a poetic tradition that they no longer themselves recognized as a common heritage. In its more abstractly developed form, the notion I referred to just earlier, that of a spoken site or location, can be distinguished also on a par with the rhetorical category of topos, of the Greek word topos, that is a theme or formula equated with the physical features of a site. And a case in point is the imagining of truth itself as a form of dwelling place. So I give you here, this is actually the translation by Martin, a little different from the one you find in Humbach, Elfenbeinsgerbe, but the basic sense is here that, well, the swiftest steeds, probably, perhaps a metaphor for the chanting of song, will be yoked at or reach, if you choose another translation, the fine dwelling of good mind and of wisdom and of rightness or truth, and they will win good renown, good or fame. So here the farthest goal perhaps is presented as glory. This dwelling of truth is the farthest goal of these fame-winning racehorses, something like that. Well, we have a quite fascinating parallel to this, and a striking counterpart in Plato's allegory of the soul's journey, in which reference is made to a charioteer reaching a region, topos, above the heaven, so far unsung by the poets. So this is not the traditional eschatological topos, but of course we should recognize here a link to a more traditional form of poetic performance, the singing of the afterlife, yet still characteristically labeled in keeping with the eschatological imagery, the plane of truth, aletheas pedio. And also, finally, the agonistic principle of athletic achievement, so prominent in archaic Greek lyric by the late archaic period, especially in the victory odes by Pindar, which we saw examples of earlier, was not just linked to various religious, especially Orphic eschatological notions by this period, but was also picked up, it seems, and reinterpreted by other and earlier ancient Greek thinkers than Plato. I should like to end by drawing your attention to a fragmented philosophical poem by Parmenides, active in southern Italy by the early to mid 5th century BC. And in this poem about truth and being, a young charioteer receives teaching from a goddess at the gates of night and day. The introduction to the poem, the so-called proeme, contains a verse that can be seen almost as a sort of coda of the whole discourse. We find traces here, I believe, of the hereditary poetic tradition of the fame-winning chariot or chariot wheel, as clearly attested in both the Western and Vedic poetry, as I gave examples of. But this is another example from the Rig Veda. The chariot horses should convey Indra on the chariot with good wheels. It's a bit elliptic here. It says literally on the wheel or in the wheel, Suchakra, as they are charging straight on toward fame. So these are the fame-winning steeds once again, and the chariot wheel. So now, if you look at the poem by Parmenides, or the introduction to this poem, the goddess addresses this young charioteer, saying it's necessary that you learn about or inquire about pytestai, the untrembling heart of well-wheeled truth. Alethees eukykleos eto. Now, it seems as if Parmenides has reinterpreted or recoded, if you will, the salvific concept of salvific truth received in philosophical teaching in terms of, or against the background or backdrop of this heroic, the technique of praising, of laudation. Truth is likened to a well-rounded, I believe it's rather well-rolling, well-rotating wheel, not necessarily well-rounded, which responds to its outer appearance of change and movement, but at its core, at its nave or heart, is something that, if we acknowledge the fact that a chariot wheel revolves around a solid axis, remains unchanging and imperishable, just like the fame or glory of the athlete or warrior. So the Greek word kleos, as I believe, you can see example has been encrypted here in the form of a so-called hypogram. And underlying, this is, so to say, an underlying signifier heard and understood only by those attentive to the message. And you can see I've tried to give you to clarify how this might work, how you're supposed to understand this. That's, of course, in Sanskrit, these words are not really homonyms, but they could appear so in Greek. So you have the concept of suchakra, well-wheeled, corresponding to evkyklos in Greek, and then you have the concept of sushrabas in Sanskrit, which would correspond to evklees, and you can construct a form, a genitive evkykleos, if you posit a form evkykles, which is not attested. You would expect evkyklos, but if you invent the form evkykles, you would get the genitive evkykleos, and I think this is exactly what Parmenides did in order to achieve this effect. So here you have examples of this wordplay, but also what makes sense in Greek culture. If you look at the concept of ainos, which Martin has also touched upon in some of his papers, the concept of ainos underlying the concept of praise, but also meaning something enigmatic. We have the same word in the word enigmatikos. So the ancient poets are sometimes referred to as being enigmatic. So, well, I should end there. But thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Rova. I mean, this has been really a feast for the mind, and especially the issue that all of you bring out, and that is the possibilities of orality and you know, and how the Indo-European populations partook in the same system. It's really, really fascinating. Thank you, Peter. So I know that we said that we will start by having a conversation between the three of you, but as we are very short of time, if you agree, we will open the floor to discussions and the questions from the audience. Is it okay for you? Yes? Okay. So here we go. The first question, if I'm not mistaken, was posed for Almut. Right. Dear Almut, thank you for your dedicated efforts. On your slide, you mentioned gods at the top of your triangle. How does this word relate to the Zoroastrian Avestan text, in your opinion, please? The reason I'm asking is that gods are not mentioned in the Avesta text. The reference is to Ahura Mazda or Mazda Ahura. Thank you respectfully, Karishma.
Okay, thank you, Karishma, for your question. This triangle was deliberately general, and it refers to the common concept which underlies both the Vedic and the Iranian tradition. So it's an Indo-Iranian concept, most probably even with older roots reaching back to Indo-European, as Peter has pointed out. So there, it's the divine beings. And of course, in the Zoroastrian tradition, then we have peculiar developments, especially with the introduction of Ahura Mazda as the top gods. But of course, also in Zoroastrianism, you have a host of divine beings, which, however, needs to be understood within the Zoroastrian context, and they are all subordinate to Ahura Mazda. So we have the Yazatas in the Zoroastrian tradition, and Ahura Mazda is the top of all of them.
So Professor Martin has a question, and I think we give priority to Professor Martin. Go ahead, Professor Schwartz.
Yeah. Can you hear me, Parvaneh?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Very well.
If we can be given, we, the three panelists, can be given just a few minutes each
Absolutely.
for questions, I would be very grateful. It would be important to include the audience, but sometimes the audience asks very tangential questions, and if Almut
Absolutely.
and
Yes.
Peter
Sure.
have
Sure,
some
Martin.
questions
So I
as
open the floor.
panel members. I
Sure,
would be
Martin.
very grateful for that.
Sure, Martin. So what we do, we open the panel to the three of you to please, comment, discuss some of the things that you found fascinating about the topics that others have presented. So go ahead, Almut, Peter, and Martin. Please go ahead.
Well, what struck me most was how our three presentations actually made the case for orality in their own ways. And what I'm finding really fascinating in Professor Schwartz's work is how he reconstructs the processes of production of these texts on the basis of these fossilized texts as we have them.
Yeah.
And he has revealed a host of features of cross-references and structural devices which are being used in the composition of these texts. And then also equally Peter's presentation about the wider Indo-European context of the orality, and again in great detail individual passages which across different languages which show features, and I just found that really fascinating.
Yes, yes. Peter, please go ahead. Professor Schwartz, please go ahead.
Peter, you have no questions? If not, can you hear me, Peter?
Sorry. I just need to tell you a bit embarrassing, but I'm not sure for how long I can go on, because I have a child here, a 3-year-old who's running around, and I was expecting that this would end about past. Yeah. So, but it's fine.
10 more minutes, Peter.
Yeah, I will try my best. Yeah, sure. No, I was. Thank you very much. I agree with Almut. I wasn't really paying much attention at all to contemporary Zoroastrian practices until I was familiarized with this fascinating project that Almut is has been undertaking. But it's what makes me almost a bit worried is that this was for a very long time, as far as I understand, there was a great reluctance to make this public at all. Even within the Zoroastrian community, these rituals were very, performed in a very secluded fashion. And now it would be interesting to hear to hear your thoughts on what happens when this liturgy goes from being a rather hidden event to being the most well-documented, most accurately described in every detail of any ritual, so far as I can understand, where every angle is documented. So this is. It would be interesting and fascinating to hear your thoughts on that. And Martin, I have appreciated your thoughts on these cryptological techniques of Zarathustra and the Vedic poets and the Greeks. So I find it absolutely fascinating. So I also want to stress that I think that perhaps we have underestimated the level of, you refer to mystagogy in terms of initiating someone into the mysteries, which of course we associate with the late archaic period Greek, ancient Greek culture. But I think that this is a tradition that must go much further back in time.
Shall I perhaps first answer to your first question, and then Professor Schwartz? But we have some Zoroastrians here who could say how they feel about it. But as far I can say that this is not the first time that the Zoroastrian rituals have been filmed, although it has taken a long time until this happened. But even some Zoroastrian priests themselves did make films and explained them, but not of a complete ritual as we did it in Muya. Dastur Kotwal himself, he made a short film of the Yasnav performance and explained it, trying to bring it out to the wider world. So Zoroastrians have no problem in general to disseminate knowledge about their rituals. Where the secrecy comes in is that non-Zoroastrians are not permitted to be present during a real performance. So, but what we can film are stage performances, which are just the same as a ritual performance because of the invariability principle. A ritual, the Yasna ritual, is performed always in the same way, whether as a ritual commissioned by a member of the laity or whether it is commissioned by academics who want to film it. So it's not a problem. And the Zoroastrians in general are very grateful and very happy for knowledge of their religion being dispersed. But there are amongst the Zoroastrians who are here. Am I right? Is that correct, what I would have said?
Very much so, Dr. Hintze.
Thank you.
Very true.
Thank you. Sorry, Martin, I went ahead of you.
No. It's fine. May I speak now?
Yes,
Yeah,
please,
I've finished. Yeah.
I'll try to be brief. I'm very glad to have my paper between Almut's presentation and Peter Jackson Rova's presentation. In fact, I think our papers, if I may say, complement each other. And with what Peter said, he filled in a lot of what I wish I had time to say and made some very important remarks. I would like to make just a few points briefly. Like Peter, I liked Almut's figure 1, the triangle. I would add that with this triangulation of the divinity, the patron or the host, and the poet priest, you have a flow in all directions. The poet priest is the intermediator. He himself has a reciprocal relationship of reciprocity with the divinity as well as with a patron. And he also connects the patron, who will be rewarded by fame and an afterlife, with a divinity who gets praised thereby. And all these 3 points on Almut's interesting triangle, I think are covered by the word chnau in Iranian. I think I can show this, which is actually, I believe, the cognate of Greek xenia, xenouia. and refers to this reciprocal relationship and also hospitality, reciprocity. Secondly, with regard to the house of song rather than a house of welcome, I mentioned that in Rig Veda 10, Yama is said to have a residence, which is the home of the gods, in which there is the sound of the flute and the sound of phrases. Girbe, the word gir, there being the word that we have in the house of song, garo dmana. And I think from within the Gathas themselves, you have contrast of song or praise and woe, grief, the sound of grief, good food versus bad food, and hellish darkness as against heavenly light. So I affirm the old translation of Garo Dhamana's house of song or house of praise. There are also the chariot business that Peter mentioned, and the section that he presented of my translation, the context of, in the Gathas, of the chariot of the victor going to praise, to Srawa, that's in the text there, and ultimately paradise. You have, in fact, a world struggle between a bad team and a good team. Team meaning someone who isn't the people in a chariot. There's competition of chariots. In that same poem, the bad guys undergo wreckage of that part of the chariot which connects the horses with a carriage, and that's their destruction. And the game concept of all of this, the race concept, is the very physical embodiment of the rivalry, and originally was an occasion for such poetry as we have in Pindar. Finally, I think it was in Plato that Peter had the passage, the plane of truth, and in fact, we have in the Gathas allusion to the pasture of Herta, which you can say is the pasture of truth or the pasture of rightness, as a topos. And that, in fact, occurs, and this is the last thing I'll do, is in a passage, whoever is best to the righteous one, to family or community member, or through clan, Lord, or allotting diligently for the cow, he will be on the pasture of rightness and good mind. And the sounds of that are the sounds of best rightness. Yeah, our town I wahishta, waitu watma, urzana, ariamna, wa, ahura, we dance, wa, thwasahagawa, at how artahya, aha, wahush, that's a wastrai, where's the word for pasture. Conclusion of all those phrases, which symbolizes best rightness or best truth, is this artahya wastrai in the plane of in the pasture of truth. So that is an Indo-European topos, for which I thank Peter for bringing to attention. I'll say no more.
Thank you, Martin. Just what could you repeat with the passage? Where do you find it?
Yes.
Pasture of truth.
Jasna 33:3.
Ah, thank you.
Yes.
Look that up. Yeah.
Jasna 33:3.
Thank
Which begins, well, you can look at it yourself, and you can look at what is overt and what is cryptic there. And there are some other passages in the Gathas with this pasture of truth or rightness. So we can add that to our list of topoi, Indo-European topoi.
Very good.
Any more comments from our speakers? No? Well, we have given us 10 more minutes, so I have a quick question, if you don't mind, and it's one of the things that I have been thinking about, and that is, given the complexity and the and really the scruple with which these the yasna has been, according to Martin, constructed, why would there be a need for a written text, and why did it happen when it did happen at the end of the Sasanian period? And I don't take this business of you know, the Arabs coming and you know, creating, well, anyway, why do you think that's the case? Yes, Martin, please.
It's an excellent question.
Oh,
I'm glad
thank you.
asked it. The situation is this, that beginning in the Achaemenid period, we have writing, gradually the development of alphabetic writing. By the time we come to this period you're talking about, late Sasanian, let us say, if not later, Iran has been very, very literate. And what literacy does, and you can see this among generations of students. I, who memorized a great deal, was less reliant on writing. My students wrote down everything, and hence I think they committed less to memory. And now we have computers that do away with taking notes and with using our memories. So with that second stage, writing becoming predominant, I think priests began to forget. After a long mnemonic tradition, I think there was an uncertainty as to preserving the text. And by now it was usual to write down all kinds of things. So you have a massive movement of production in Pahlavi, of explanations of the Zoroastrian religion, translations, explanations, and with that, this marvelous invention of the very wonderfully, precisely phonetic alphabet in which the Avesta is written down, which is really one of the high points of intellectual history of the Iranian people. And so that's I think that anxiety that people wouldn't remember it rightly resulted in the process of its being written down. I think that's the chief thing. Perhaps someone can think of a few other factors.
Perhaps one could add also pressure from competing religions, Manichaeism and Christianity. Both of them put great emphasis on writing. The Manichaeans actually, Mani writes deliberate. He writes, in contrast to the Zoroastrians, he writes. And then he translates everything also into many, many different languages. So it could have been that there was also pressure from other religions, so that the Zoroastrian priesthood wanted to reassert their own tradition as having a written one as well as an oral one.
Yeah, and especially as we move into the Islamic period, it becomes more important for them to be a people of the book. I think that's a good point.
Yeah, thank you so much. This all makes very much sense. Just the last thing that I wanted to add. The reason I was asking this is that there is a consensus, or there seems to be a consensus around the fact that between the 6th to 8th centuries, various books of various traditions, including the Talmud, the coming of the Talmud and whatnot, between the 6th to 8th century, that these were canonized. Under what sort of stimuli, I don't know, but yeah, that's where my questioning. But the Manichaeans, Almut, that you said makes very much sense. The Manichaean tradition, yeah. So I think unfortunately, okay, let me just read the last question. This is also from from one of our colleagues to Professor Jackson Rova. The question is that your presentation of the concept of reward deviates from my understanding of the Gothic indication of outcome, as in Yasna 48.4, which is the outcome that will be in line with one's thoughts and actions. Can you comment on this, please?
Yeah, I'm not sure I see any obvious conflict between the concept of outcome and reward. I think it's very important that if it's the word mishta can be understood in a very concrete term as the fee. You have to correct me here if I'm wrong, but if the payment you get in form of commodities or in the form of animals, but also something that could be thought of in purely spiritual terms. So the outcome. Outcome, of course, the result, the end result, to some extent also in spiritual terms. So I see no contrast or conflict here. Or would you disagree, Almut?
No, well, no, not at all. And it's the Mijda is really the prize at stake. And that fits very well with the race metaphor, also the ritual as a race. And it's the prize which one wins through the ritual. And then also it's understood metaphorically as the prize which one wins at the last turning point. So as an eschatological term.
Okay, well.
So it's both a priestly fee, it's used like the dakshina in India, has the priestly fee, which is due at the end of the ritual. But again, that is the prize which one wins through the ritual, which is perceived as a competition. And also it's the prize which one wins as a reward in an eschatological sense.
You know, we have the concept, of course, or the word itself in Greek, with a similar
mistos,
with a similar meaning, also used in this double sense, and also used by philosophers in reference to the reward of philosophy. Aristotle talks about philosophy as mistos. You know?
Yeah.
So philosophy is the only activity that is its own reward. he says. It's his idea that you don't need to, it's its own reward. You don't need to, among all the other things that are good and worthy activities, you need to relax from something you've done when you've done a good work, but philosophy is its own reward. So that's mistos.
Yeah.
And I would stress also the Mishnah being eschatological reward, as well as all of this. I just,
May I ask another quick question? Is Mijdak by any chance related to the new Persian word mujda? I mean, please excuse my, I might be totally ignorant about this, but is it, do they share the same root? Perhaps?
which is the Persian word you're referring to?
Mujde.
Yes.
And there's
yes.
mizd also. Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, the reason, okay, one last thought. The reason that I'm saying this is that I think the epithet of Mazdak is actually Mujdak. Could that be?
There is
In the
also,
sense of, sense, yes, go ahead, Albert.
of the as the rewarding one.
As good omen, as a good omen, so to speak. As one who comes in front of say Mitra that is coming.
Yeah. Well, there is also mead also in Vedic, of course, it's midha, and there is the adjective mead one. And so what the adjective which you are quoting, that is an adjective with formed with a suffix from this noun.
Yeah, okay.
If I may answer your question also,
Sure.
Parvaneh,
Sure.
unless you have evidence that the figure in late Sasanian history called Mazdak, a religious innovator who brought great social upheaval, apparently, in Iran. Unless you have evidence that his name was not Mazdak, but Muz, or something like that, or Mijdak, Muzdak. Unless you have evidence, I think it's just a very common sort of name based on Mazda, simply. That is the onomastic, that is the naming, important naming concept in Iran.
Yes.
Just as you have people named after Mehr. Mitra,
right. So Martin, the one thing is that orthography, the Arabic orthography through which we have, all our information about Mazdak, sometimes precludes the use of vowels and whatnot. So we have been reading it Mazdak. I don't know why. So I don't know whether there has been any indication of the vowelization of the name.
Well, we have a long tradition of personal names, really long tradition, and there's a whole project which has been going on for years of the Austrian Academy of Iranian names, and while names based on Mazda are very, very commonly attested from the most ancient period onward, I don't think we have any personal names that involve Mishda. There may be one or two in the Elamite corpus, but even of that, I'm not sure. So unless there is reason to say that Mujdak, and then what?
Okay.
Yeah. And then,
Okay. So the only thing that I can say to that, Martin, is that I will be arguing that Mazdakism is actually Mithraism in disguise. Yeah, they're actually Mithraism. So because there's so much evidence, and what I will discuss that with you in some other time that we have more time. Anyway.
Parvaneh,
Yes.
Parvaneh, before you finish, may I very briefly have 30 seconds, please?
Sure. Okay, go ahead, please.
In support of the excellent points Professor Jackson Rova and Martin Schwartz, and indeed Professor Hintze have talked about in terms of the material and the spiritual, and in the light of your question about Mizdem, there is a beautiful prayer called the Ayrima Ishyo Yasna 54, which actually
Yes.
quotes this in the light
That's
of the
powerful.
Daina, and a very powerful prayer in terms of its meaning and vibrations. It says, Ya Daina Vairim Hanat Mizdem, Ashaya Yasa Ashim, Yam Ishyam Ahuro Masata Mazdao. So this puts into the
So
context.
can you translate, please?
So Ya Daina, this is only the last part.
Yeah,
The whole
Ya
prayer
Daina.
is a little bit longer. Ya Daina, the religion, the
Yes,
faith.
yes, yes, yes,
Ya
yes.
Daina, Vairim, by desire, by choice. Vairim Hanat Mizdem is the reward or gift, some people will translate, like Ervat Soli Dastur.
Uh-huh. Mhm.
Ya Daina, Vairim Hanat Mizdem, Ashaya Yasa Ashim. So in the light of Asha,
Mhm,
Ashaya Yasa
mhm.
Ashim,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Masata Mazda. Airyama Ishyo Rafedra Izantu Nerebiascha Nairibiascha Zarathustra. So come to my support, people of women and men of Ahura Mazda. Yadaina Vairim Hanat. Oh goodness. I just do it once in completeness. Airyama Ishyo Rafedra Izantu Nerebiascha Nairibiascha Zarathustra. Vangeush Rafedrai Manango, Ya Daina Vairim Hanat Mizdem, Ashaya Yasa Ashim, Yam Ishyam Ahuro Masata Mazdao. Come to my support of people of good mind of Zarathustra, both women and men, so that I may get the righteous reward of the Daina.
Yeah.
In the light of Ahura Mazda, something
Mhm.
to that effect.
Mhm. Thank
That
you.
talks about all these concepts and answers your question on Mizdem.
Yes. Okay. I will do this last question because it's interesting. Professor Schwartz, since you mentioned that Iran was very literate at the time, would you expect there was formerly a large amount of commentary, mythological and historical Zoroastrian literature that didn't survive the invasion? Well, anyway, Martin,
yeah, I mean, well, for example, as far as the Avesta itself is concerned, only about a fourth survived. We can tell that from the list of contents of the Avesta that we actually have in the Dainkeres. So we know that there were books and many compositions that are alluded to that did not survive. On that basis, we can say only a fourth survived. So indeed, and then with regard to Pahlavi, we must have had a very large philosophical, in the usual sense, philosophical and scientific literature, some of it translation literature in Pahlavi. We know the names of some of those texts, but very, very unfortunately, they have not survived. Exist, they had to have existed, but the selection seems to have been of religious texts. I won't go into anything more than that, but sure, a lot was lost a lot of the Avesta and a lot of the Pahlavi literature.
I thought myself that when you say literate, you mean orally literate. I mean, literacy does not have to be written, right?
In the last context, I mean written.
Okay.
I mean
Okay.
Pahlavi texts,
Okay.
written in the Pahlavi alphabet. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Which we have a large literature, but hardly anything what there once was, written down, translated from Greek sources by Syriac and so forth and so on. So, yeah, so we
Okay.
lost a lot, certainly of the secular domain of written literature, but also the preservation of the ancient Avesta. It was written down, but we don't have all.
Okay. So on that note, thank you very much, everybody. First of all, thanks to our speakers, Professor Hintze, Professor Rova, and Professor Schwartz. Thank you so much for agreeing and honoring us and appearing on our on the circles panels. And we really appreciate it. All colleagues and friends that have stayed with us for one of our longest presentations. Thank you so much for joining us, and please be with us next fall when we start our presentations again. Thank you profusely. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Parvaneh, for bringing this together, and the members of the circle that facilitated it.
Yes.
And
Thank
thanks to
you.
everyone.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Parvaneh.
Yeah, my pleasure. It was really a feast for the ears and the mind. Okay, thank you so much. I'm going to disconnect, although I
Bye.
don't like to, but okay, on that note, thank you very much.
Bye-bye.